This is a reading of Paralipomena on the Concept of History by Walter Benjamin. Empathy with the past serves not least to make the past seem present. It is no coincidence that this tendency accords very well with a positivist conception of history, as seen in Edouard Meyer. In the field of history, the projection of the past into the present is analogous to the substitution of homogeneous configurations for changes in the physical world. The latter process has been identified by Meyerson as the basis of the natural sciences. The former is the quintessence of the scientific character of history, as defined by positivism. It is secured at the cost of completely eradicating every vestige of history's original role as remembrance. The false aliveness of the past made present, the elimination of every echo of a lament from history, marks history's final subjection to the modern concept of science. In other words, the project of discovering laws for the course of historical events is not the only means and hardly the most subtle of assimilating historiography to natural science. The notion that the historian's task is to make the past present is guilty of the same fraudulence and is far less transparent. In the idea of classless society, Marx secularized the idea of messianic time, and that was a good thing. It was only when the social democrats elevated this idea to an ideal that the trouble began. The ideal was defined in Neo-Kantian doctrine as an infinite task, and this doctrine was the school philosophy of the Social Democratic Party, from Schmidt and Stadler through Nathorp and Vorland. Once the classless society had been defined as an infinite task, the empty and homogeneous time was transformed into an anteroom, so to speak, in which one could wait for the emergence of the revolutionary situation with more or less equanimity. In reality, there is not a moment that would not carry with it its revolutionary chance, provided only that it is defined in a specific way, namely as the chance for a completely new resolution of a completely new problem. For the revolutionary thinker, the peculiar revolutionary chance offered by every historical moment gets its warrant from the political situation. But it is equally grounded for this thinker in the right of entry which the historical moment enjoys vis-a-vis a quite distinct chamber of the past, one which up to that point has been closed and locked. The entrance into this chamber coincides in a strict sense with political action, and it is by means of such entry that political action, however destructive, reveals itself as messianic. Class society is not the final goal of historical progress, but is frequently miscarried, ultimately achieved interruption. The historical materialist who investigates the structure of history performs in his way a sort of spectrum analysis, just as a physicist determines the presence of ultraviolet light in the solar spectrum. So the historical materialist determines the presence of a messianic force in history. Whoever wishes to know what the situation of a redeemed humanity might actually be, what conditions are required for the development of such a situation, and when this development can be expected to occur, poses questions to which there are no answers. He might just as well seek to know the color of ultraviolet rays. Marx says that revolutions are the locomotive of world history, but perhaps it is quite otherwise. Perhaps revolutions are an attempt by the passengers on this train, namely the human race, to activate the emergency brake. Three basic concepts can be identified in Marx's work, and its entire theoretical armature can be seen as an attempt to weld these three concepts together. They are the class struggle of the proletariat, the course of historical development, progress, and the classless society. The structure of Marx's basic idea is as follows. Through a series of class struggles, humanity attains to a classless society in the course of historical development. But classless society is not to be conceived as the endpoint of historical development. From this erroneous conception, Marx's epigones have derived, among other things, the notion of the revolutionary situation, which, as we know, has always refused to arrive. A genuinely messianic face must be restored to the concept of classless society and, to be sure, in the interest of furthering the revolutionary politics of the proletariat itself. New Thesis B. History deals with connections and with arbitrarily elaborated causal chains, but since history affords an idea of the fundamental citability of its object, this object must present itself, in its ultimate form, as a moment of humanity. In this moment, time must be brought to a standstill. The dialectical image is an occurrence of ball lightning that runs across the whole horizon of the past. Articulating the past historically means recognizing those elements of the past which come together in the constellation of a single moment. Historical knowledge is possible only within the historical moment, but knowledge within the historical moment is always knowledge of a moment. In drawing itself together in the moment, in the dialectical image, the past becomes part of humanity's involuntary memory. The dialectical image can be defined as the involuntary memory of redeemed humanity. The notion of a universal history is bound up with the notion of progress and the notion of culture. In order for all the moments in the history of humanity to be incorporated in the chain of history, they must be reduced to a common denominator: culture, enlightenment, the objective spirit, or whatever one wishes to call it. New Thesis C. Only when the course of historical events runs through the historian's hands smoothly, like a thread, can one speak of progress. If, however, it is a frayed bundle unraveling into 1,000 strands that hang down like unplaited hair, none of them has a definite place until they are all gathered up and braided into a coiffure. The basic conception in myth is the world as punishment which actually engenders those to whom punishment is due. Eternal recurrence is the punishment of being held back in school, projected onto the cosmic fear. Humanity has to copy out its text in endless repetitions. It's from Eloire Repetition. The eternity of punishment in hell may have sheared off the most terrible spike from the ancient idea of eternal recurrence. It substitutes an eternity of torment for the eternity of a cycle. Thinking the idea of eternal recurrence once more in the 19th century, Nietzsche becomes the figure on whom mythic doom is now carried out, for the essence of mythic happenings is recurrence. New Thesis H. The dissolution into pragmatic history ought not to benefit cultural history. Moreover, the pragmatic conception of history does not founder on the demands made by strict science in the name of the law of causality. It founders on a shift in historical perspective. An age that is no longer able to transfigure its positions of power in an original way loses its understanding of the transfigurations which benefited such positions in the past. The history-writing subject is, properly, that part of humanity whose solidarity embraces all the oppressed. It is the part which can take the greatest theoretical risks because, in practical terms, it has the least to lose. Universal histories are not inevitably reactionary, but a universal history without a structural principle is reactionary. The structural principle of universal history allows it to be represented in partial histories. It is, in other words, a monadological principle. It exists within Salvation history. The idea of prose coincides with the messianic idea of universal history. New Thesis K. For to organize pessimism means to discover in the space of political action image space. This image space, however, can no longer be measured out by contemplation. The long-sought image space, the world of universal and integral actuality. Redemption is the limes of progress. The messianic world is the world of universal and integral actuality. Only in the messianic realm does a universal history exist, not as written history, but as festively enacted history. This festival is purified of all celebration. There are no festive songs. Its language is liberated prose which has burst the fetters of script. The idea of prose coincides with the messianic idea of universal history. Compare the passage in The Storyteller, the types of artistic prose as the spectrum of historical types. The multiplicity of histories is closely related, if not identical, to the multiplicity of languages. Universal history in the present-day sense is never more than a kind of Esperanto. It expresses the hope of the human race no more effectively than the name of that universal language. The Now of Recognizability. The saying that the historian is a prophet facing backward can be understood in two ways. Traditionally, it has meant that the historian, transplanting himself into a remote past, prophesies what was regarded as the future at that time, but meanwhile has become the past. This view corresponds exactly to the historical theory of empathy, which Fustel de Coulanges encapsulated in the following advice. A note from the reader. Rather than butcher this long French passage, I'm just going to read you the translation. The translation in English is, if you want to relive an era, forget that you know what happened after it. I'll continue with the text now. But the saying can also be understood to mean something quite different. The historian turns his back on his own time, and his seer's gaze is kindled by the peaks of earlier generations as they sink further and further into the past. Indeed, the historian's own time is far more distinctly present to this visionary gaze than it is to the contemporaries who keep step with it. The concept of a present, which represents the intentional subject matter of a prophecy, is defined by Turgot, not without reason, as an essentially and fundamentally political concept. Before we have learned to deal with things in a given position, says Turgot, it has already changed several times. Thus, we always find out too late about what has happened, and therefore it can be said that politics is obliged to foresee the present. It is precisely this concept of the present which underlies the actuality of genuine historiography. Someone who pokes about in the past as if rummaging in a storeroom of examples and analogies still has no inkling of how much in a given moment depends on its being made present. A note from the reader. You will hear passages in this next section which you have already heard in former section. I assure you that that is actually how this text is written, and I assume I ought to read this in this way it was intended by the writer. I'm merely telling you this so that you don't need to pause and check the recording for errors. The Dialectical Image. If one looks upon history as a text, then one can say of it what a recent author has said of literary text, namely that the past has left in them images comparable to those registered by a light-sensitive plate. The future alone possesses developers strong enough to reveal the image in all its details. Many pages in Marivaux or Rousseau contain a mysterious meaning which the first readers of these texts could not fully have deciphered. The historical method is a philological method based on the Book of Life. Read what was never written, runs a line in Hofmannsthal. The reader one should think of here is the true historian. The multiplicity of histories resembles the multiplicity of languages. Universal history, in the present-day sense, can never be more than a kind of Esperanto. The idea of universal history is a messianic idea. The messianic world is the world of universal and integral actuality. Only in the messianic realm does a universal history exist, not as written history, but as festively enacted history. This festival is purified of all celebration. There are no festive songs. Its language is liberated prose which has burst the fetters of script, and is understood by all people as the language of birds is understood by Sunday's children. The idea of prose coincides with the messianic idea of universal history, the types of artistic prose as the spectrum of universal historical types. A conception of history that has liberated itself from the schema of progression within an empty and homogeneous time would finally unleash the destructive energies of historical materialism which have held back for so long. This would threaten the three most important positions of historicism. The first attack must be aimed at the idea of universal history. Now that the nature of peoples is obscured by their current structural features as much as by their current relationships to one another, the notion that the history of humanity is composed of peoples is a mere refuge of intellectual laziness. The idea of a universal history stands and falls with the idea of a universal language. As long as the latter had a basis, whether in theology, as in the Middle Ages, or in logic, as more recently in Leibniz, universal history was not wholly inconceivable. By contrast, universal history as practiced since the 19th century can never have been more than a kind of Esperanto. The second fortified position of historicism is evident in the idea that history is something which can be narrated. In a materialist investigation, the epic moment will always be blown apart in the process of construction. The liquidation of the epic moment must be accepted, as Marx did when he wrote Capital. He realized that the history of capital could be constructed only within the broad steel framework of a theory. In Marx's theoretical sketch of labor under the dominion of capital, humanity's interests are better looked after than in the monumental, long-winded, and basically lackadaisical works of historicism. It is more difficult to honor the memory of the anonymous than it is to honor the memory of the famous, the celebrated, not excluding poets and thinkers. The historical construction is dedicated to the memory of the anonymous. The third bastion of historicism is the strongest and the most difficult to overrun. It presents itself as empathy with the victor. The rulers at any time are the heirs of all those who have been victorious throughout history. Empathizing with the victor invariably benefits those currently ruling. The historical materialist respects this fact. He also realizes that this state of affairs is well-founded. Whoever has emerged victorious in the 1,000 struggles traversing history up to the present day has his share in the triumphs of those now ruling over those now ruled. The historical materialist can only take a highly critical view of the inventory of spoils displayed by the victors before the vanquished. This inventory is called culture. For in every case these treasures have a lineage which the historical materialist cannot contemplate without horror. They owe their existence not only to the efforts of the great geniuses who created them, but also to the anonymous toil of others who lived in the same period. There is no document of culture which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. The historical materialist keeps his distance from all this. He has to brush history against the grain, even if he needs a barge pole to do it. Categories for developing the concept of historical time. The concept of historical time forms an antithesis to the idea of temporal continuum. The eternal lamp is an image of genuine historical existence. It cites what has been the flame that once was kindled, in perpetuum, giving it ever new sustenance. The existence of the classless society cannot be thought at the same time that the struggle for it is thought, but the concept of the present in its binding sense for the historian is necessarily defined by these two temporal orders. Without some sort of essay of the classless society, there is only a historical accumulation of the past. To this extent, every concept of the present participates in the concept of Judgment Day. The saying from an apocryphal gospel, "Where I meet someone, there will I judge him," casts a peculiar light on the idea of last judgment. It recalls Kafka's note, "The last judgment is a kind of summary justice." But it adds to this something else. The day of judgment, according to this saying, would not be distinguishable from other days. At any rate, this gospel saying furnishes the canon for the concept of the present, which the historian makes his own. Every moment is a moment of judgment concerning certain moments that preceded it. Excerpts from Fuchs' essay. The passage on Youkman's visionary gaze should be worked into the basic structure of the arcades. The seer's gaze is kindled by the rapidly receding past. That is to say, the prophet has turned away from the future. He perceives the contours of the future in the fading light of the past, as it sinks before him into the night of times. The prophetic relation to the future necessarily informs the attitude of the historian as Marx describes it, an attitude determined by actual social circumstances. Should criticism and prophecy be the categories that come together in the redemption of the past? How should critique of the past, for example, Youkman, be joined to the redemption of the past? To grasp the eternity of historical events is really to appreciate the eternity of their transience.